really valuable. Okay, so learning topic for Unit 3. It's actually probably my favorite topic that we covered in senior psychology. So classical conditioning is very interesting. So, sorry, excuse me. So there's 3 major types of behavior learning that we're going to hopefully have time to have a quick look at all of them today. We've still got about 45 minutes together, so I think we'll definitely be able to have a look at those ones. So our first one is classical conditioning, which we're going to have a look at now, followed by operant conditioning, and then observational learning. So there are 3 major types of learning. So our first one is classical conditioning, which was actually first kind of coined by Ivan Pavlov. You may have heard of the famous experiment of Pavlov's dogs, where he actually classically conditioned a group of dogs to drool in response to when they heard a bell. Whereas the first time they heard a bell, it didn't make them drool, but by pairing the sound of a bell with the dog's food, which did make them drool, he eventually actually trained the dogs to drool just to the sound of a bell, which is quite a strange thought. So classical conditioning is about the involuntary association, so it's unconscious, you don't have to think about it, between 2 stimuluses. So we have 3 phases in our conditioning. We have our before conditioning, we have during conditioning, and we have after conditioning. So after the classical conditioning, after the learning has occurred. So we have lots of letters here. I'm sorry we don't have what they stand for written on the screen, but I'll go through what each one of them means. So UCS is the unconditioned, so UCS, unconditioned stimulus, elicits UCR, unconditioned response. So before we undergo any conditioning, so before the dogs underwent conditioning in Pavlov's experiment, the unconditioned stimulus, which is something that naturally elicits the unconditioned response. So in Pavlov's experiment, the unconditioned stimulus was the food. The dogs did not need any conditioning, they did not need any learning. The food naturally elicited an unconditioned response, which is the natural response, which was in this experiment, the drooling. So the unconditioned stimulus, which is the food, naturally elicits the unconditioned response, which in our experiment here is the drooling. And then NS stands for our neutral stimulus, which is actually our stimulus that initially doesn't have any meaning. It's just neutral. For example, the bell. It didn't mean anything to the dogs at first. And the neutral stimulus does not elicit the conditioned response because conditioning has not happened yet. So the neutral stimulus is still neutral, doesn't mean anything. But the process of classical conditioning is about associating a desired response with this neutral stimulus. So I know it's a lot of terminology, but we'll definitely spend some time going over that today to, hopefully make that make a little bit more sense. So during conditioning, the idea of classical conditioning is that the unconditioned response, so the natural response that's elicited in response to an unconditioned stimulus, so our natural response of drooling and our neutral stimulus, our bell, our thing that doesn't mean anything at first, are actually associated through repeated pairing. So how Pavlov actually did this in his experiment, how he actually classically conditioned these dogs, was each time they were given their food, the unconditioned stimulus, that produced the unconditioned response, the drooling. So what Pavlov did was he paired the neutral stimulus, the bell, with the unconditioned stimulus, the food, every time. So every time the dogs were given food, they heard a bell, and the food was actually what was making them drool. But the interesting change is that after conditioning, the neutral stimulus actually becomes a conditioned stimulus, which elicits a conditioned response. So while during conditioning, our food and our bell are paired, and so the dog's given food makes them drool, but they're also hearing a bell. the dogs are unconsciously pairing and associating the food and the drool with the bell. And then so after conditioning, the result of this actually is that the neutral stimulus, our bell, which actually didn't even mean anything at first, becomes a conditioned stimulus, which is the neutral stimulus after conditioning has occurred. So after we've learned to associate a particular response with it, which elicits the conditioned response, which is your learned reaction to the conditioned stimulus. So after conditioning, when the dogs heard the bell, they actually drooled, even though there was no food, because they had learnt unconsciously to associate the conditioned stimulus and produce a conditioned response, which is actually such like an interesting thing that Pavlov discovered. So that's a quick overview of classical conditioning. Another very famous, very unethical experiment you actually might look at in class that's to do with this is the Little Albert experiment, which is very, very, very unethical. It's actually crazy to think of some of the things that they did in traditional psychology research, which has taught us so much, but is also quite a terrible thing. Because whereas conditioning the dogs to drool in response to a bell, some people could see that as unethical. There's no long-term consequences of that because that conditioning can actually be undone, which is what we're talking about on our next slide. But the issue with the Little Albert experiment was that, struggling to remember the name of our psychologist at the moment, but our psychologist actually conditioned a baby that had the pseudonym of Little Albert to exhibit a fear response in response to neutral stimulus. I believe it was like a bunny or something along those lines, or a white soft toy that Albert initially was not afraid of, but the psychologist actually like made a lot of loud and scary noises when he presented Albert with the little bunny. And then after the conditioning occurred, Albert actually produced a fear response in response to the little bunny, which was once a neutral stimulus, but it had now become a conditioned stimulus, which elicits the conditioned response, which was that Albert would cry and be afraid. So that's actually incredibly unethical because this psychologist actually trained a little baby to be afraid of a previously neutral stimulus for no reason. And he actually it's actually unsure whether that conditioning process was actually undone. And even who little Albert remains a little bit of a mystery. There was some speculation that he actually died at age 6, but again, because it was all very unethical, it was very unregulated, it's actually quite a mystery and quite an awful thing for him to have done. We did learn from that, but that is a very, very terrible experiment that was carried out, which is why ethics in psychology is so important that we consider that and focus on learning about that today. So there are 2 experiments, just a brief overview of 2 experiments that you might hear in relation to the idea of classical conditioning. So these are the other terminology that I alluded to on our earlier slides. So generalization is when something similar to the conditioned stimulus produces the conditioned response. So an example of generalization would be when little Albert was actually conditioned to be afraid of, I believe it was the little bunny, like a white beard or Santa Claus actually made him cry as well because he generalized the stimulus. So actually a lot of white and fluffy things, my mistake. It was actually a live white rat, not a bunny. But when the stimulus was generalized, a rabbit, a fur coat, and Santa Claus all made him cry because the white fluffy things were enough, even though they weren't the white rat that he was conditioned to be afraid of. He was conditioned to be afraid of, by Watson and Rayner. They're our psychologists for that experiment. So little Albert was conditioned by Watson and Rayner to be afraid of the white rat, but because generalization occurred in classical conditioning, he actually became afraid and produced the fear response in response to similar stimuluses, such as the Santa Claus's beard, the fluffy bunny, and the fluffy white coat. They actually all made him cry, whereas previously those things had no response on him and they actually hadn't made him upset. Whereas on the opposite end of that is discrimination. Pardon me, when stimulus discrimination occurs, when something similar to the conditioned stimulus does not produce a conditioned response. So for example, if the white bunny had not made little Albert cry, he would have been exhibiting stimulus discrimination. Or for example, if you were attacked by a dog and that has actually caused you to be very fearful of dogs, generalization would mean that you're afraid of all dogs, whereas discrimination would be discerning that you only need to be afraid of that particular dog. So that's kind of the difference between our generalization, applying the response to any stimulus, and our discrimination, which is actually being able to tell the difference and only producing the response that you've been conditioned to produce in response to that initial neutral but now conditioned stimulus. On the other hand, extinction is actually when a conditioned stimulus becomes neutral again. So when the conditioning process is actually kind of undone and you stop producing a conditioned response to the stimulus that was conditioned. So that kind of relationship has stopped occurring. So for example, with little Albert, if extinction was performed, it's not documented whether it was or was not, which is a further ethical issue in this already horrendous experiment. If extinction had occurred, Albert could have potentially gone on and not been afraid and not produced those fear responses in response to the conditioned stimulus. However, again, like I said before, we're actually not sure if that did occur. So the process of extinction means that the conditioned response ceases to occur. The conditioned stimulus no longer produces a conditioned response and the bell becomes neutral again. The bell, thinking back to Pavlov's dogs. So if extinction occurred with Pavlov's dogs, when they heard the sound of a bell, the previously neutral stimulus, if extinction has occurred, then it's no longer a conditioned stimulus and they no longer occur in response. That response no longer occurs in response to the stimulus. And that can happen through repeated occurrences of that conditioned stimulus, the bell, without the association of for example, with the dogs, the food. So if Pavlov had rung the bell with no pairing with the food, the dogs might have eventually relearned, oh, bell doesn't actually mean food anymore, so I am actually not going to drool in response. Whereas spontaneous recovery is actually when a previously learnt but now extinct behavior spontaneously comes back. So extinction would be the bell rings, the dogs don't feel the need to drool anymore, but spontaneous recovery would be one day if someone randomly rung a bell and that conditioned response actually just spontaneously came back. So that's our extinction and our spontaneous recovery if the conditioned response spontaneously comes